Well, you've made it to part 4, and by now we only have a few more lessons left, but we're basically in the last phase of our quilt creation. Now this is all about getting that binding onto our quilt and finishing it up, and I'm going to separate the binding into 2 lessons just to keep these instructions in short bites. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to cut out and make the binding, and then in the second half we're going to actually sew the binding on. But before we even get to this, we're going to trim off this excess batting and backing, and as we're doing this, we want to really make sure that the corners that we're going to cut are clean, crisp, and a true 90-degree angle. Now, our most useful tool for this is going to be our trusty quilter's ruler. Now, this is the same ruler that you saw me use in part 1, and this is our acrylic 6 by 24 inch ruler. So we're going to grab your rotary cutter, which you should have on hand because we also used this in the first part as well, so we are going to need it again. And before we even think about the binding, we are going to need to trim off this excess. So our original plans for this quilt is of course a rectangle. Remember, we're using a 6 by 7 square pattern. And as we go along, things will tend to get pushed and pulled and maybe a little bit puckered, and the edges can possibly turn into some maybe wonky slants, and really that's okay. These things are going to happen. And the more you practice, the more control that you'll have over keeping everything nice and neat and even. But we do want to make sure that we kind of recalibrate at times and we keep our project in a square or in a rectangle shape that we originally intended when we first started. So I'm going to pick a corner and I'm going to lay the quilt over my cutting mat, and I'm also going to lay my ruler directly over the corner that I'm starting at, and we're going to use this as a guide to straighten out these edges. And so I'm going to line this up and I'm going to make sure that my corner is at an even 90 degrees. Now you've been looking at the top piece on your project by now for several hours, and you may be sure that it's perfectly straight, but really it's more likely that it's just a little bit uneven. So we're going to trust your ruler and we're going to observe this and just cut away any excess overflow. If one square is just a little bit more off than the others and you feel worried that you're cutting a little bit too much, as long as you're making a straight and even line, don't worry. Once we get everything in place, no one's going to know if you trimmed off a little bit extra on 2 or 3 of these squares. We just want to make sure that we have nice straight lines. Now, your ruler is 24 inches long, so it's shorter than the length of your quilt. So we're going to measure out and we're going to cut the corners first. And then we can go back and we can trust these cut edges and we can line the ruler up with the edges that you've already cut, and we can connect these cut lines together. And so now once we have everything evenly cut out, we can go ahead and move on to the next part. Now we're going to calculate how much fabric that we're going to cut for our binding. Now I'm using the exact same white poly cotton that was left over from the 2 yards of backing. And typically you're going to pick out a complementary color that you want for your binding, but remember, for this project, I'm keeping this as simple as possible, so we're going to be using the easiest yardage. So for the first thing that we need to do is we need to measure the perimeter of our quilt. Now my quilt is now 32 by 36 by 32 by 36 inches. So that adds up to 136 inches. And we're just going to add in 10 inches, and this is just to give ourselves a little bit of a room for a little overlap, maybe some seam allowance, a little bit of room for that mitered corner that we're going to create. So all in all, I need 146 inches of length of our fabric. Now the cotton yardage that I bought was 44 inches long. If you're buying pre-cut 2 yards of cotton pieces, that's pretty typical. You'll find them that they'll come in 44-inch lengths. So I can only cut a 44-inch strip, but I need a 146-inch strip essentially for this binding to go all the way around. So I'm going to need to divide 146 by 44, and that's going to give me 3.32 strips of fabric. Now I'm not going to cut a 0.32 strip of fabric, so we need to round that up, and this tells us that we're going to need to cut 4 strips. So I need 4 strips of fabric. Now, for my binding, we're going to be using a 2.5-inch wide piece. So 2.5 inches times 4 is 10 inches. So the piece of fabric that we need to create our binding is going to be a piece that is 10 inches by 44 inches. And just like I mentioned, that's going to be then cut into 4 2.5-inch strips. So on this table, I have my white cotton on the cutting mat. And I already have this pressed, so it's easy for you to see in the camera while we cut it. But you'll notice that this piece doesn't look like 44 inches, and that's because I've already folded it in half, and I'm going to cut it folded, so I'm really just making a 22-inch cut. Now you don't have to do this, but this does make it easier to keep everything straight. So here, you're going to quickly see why it helps when our rulers are transparent. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a straight edge to work with. So with my ruler, I'm looking over here at the right side of the fabric. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a line with a perfect 90-degree corner. Now, while you're looking at this, make sure everything's straight and just cut a straight edge. You can use the lines on the mat and the lines on the ruler. Just make sure that it's nice and even. And now that I have a straight cut right here on the right, this is a cut that I can trust. I'm just going to slide my ruler over to the other side, and I'm going to keep a 2.5-inch strip underneath the ruler, and I'm going to line it up perfectly, and I'm going to cut a 2.5-inch strip. Now very carefully, I'm going to take this away, and then I'm going to place my ruler back over the fabric, and I'm going to cut another 2.5-inch strip. And then I'll do this 2 more times. Now I need to turn 4 strips into 1 long strip. So we're going to take this back over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew these pieces on one right after another, and we're going to give it a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that's just like we've been doing with every other thing on this project. This is not any different. So let's go ahead and do that. Now that our binding is one long piece that is the correct size for the project, we're going to prep it up before we move along to the very last part. So I'm going to take this back over to my wool iron pad. So each of the 4 connecting seams are going to be ironed flat with their faces open. And as I go down this piece, I'm going to fold the strip in half, and I'm going to iron it in half the long way. Now in every case, when you're making your binding, you're going to iron the wrong sides together. But as you recall, our cotton solid doesn't have an obvious wrong side and right side. So you need to make sure that you're ironing the seams to the inside. So in our case, the wrong side is the side that has the seams on it. So the seams will face itself when it's folded in half. And once we're finished prepping this binding, all we have left to do is now attach it to the quilt. And so we're finished with this lesson, and we can move along to lesson 5.